It wasn't love. It was an awakening disguised as affection, a mirror held up by life to expose what you refused to see about yourself. You thought it was connection, that rare meeting of two souls who understand each other without words, but what it truly was education through pain. Every glance, every silence, every moment that felt like destiny was in fact a classroom, and you, blind with longing, believed the test was about keeping them, but the real exam was always about learning to keep yourself. There comes a point when the universe stops giving you gentle hints and starts cutting directly into your illusions. That person didn't come to complete you. They came to confront you. You mistook friction for chemistry, chaos for passion, and their inconsistency for mystery. But if you look closer, you'll realize they were simply the reflection of your unresolved patterns, the living embodiment of what you hadn't yet healed. You attracted them, not because they were meant to stay, but because they carried the exact lesson you needed to evolve. Love that begins with intensity often ends with revelation. The way they looked at you was never about you. It was about what they wanted to see, what they projected, what they thought you could be for them. The tragedy isn't that they left. The tragedy is that you didn't leave when your soul first whispered that something was off. You ignored that whisper, didn't you? Because it sounded too much like truth. You stayed, hoping that love could rewrite what patterns refused to unlearn. But love cannot heal dysfunction when that love is built on illusion. You thought you were falling for them, but you were falling into yourself, into the parts of your psyche that still sought validation, approval, or salvation. Every unanswered message, every sudden withdrawal, every contradiction was not an attack. It was instruction. Life was teaching you emotional independence through disappointment. It was teaching you that not everyone who touches you deserves to stay, and that sometimes the most powerful form of love is the one that ends. You see, endings are sacred. They are the moment when the mask of fantasy falls and truth finally enters. You mistook the temporary high of attention for the permanence of affection. That's why it hurt so much, not because they were special, but because your illusion was. They were the vessel, not the destination. They were the means through which you would learn the ultimate discipline, detachment. The mind that chases approval always suffers. The heart that waits for reciprocation always bleeds. But the soul that understands that pain is a teacher. That soul becomes untouchable. You didn't lose them. You lost the version of yourself that needed them. That's evolution. The one who walks away from illusions doesn't walk away empty-handed. They walk away cleansed. You became quieter, colder perhaps, but wiser. Because once you see through emotional manipulation, you can never unsee it. Once you realize that people will give you fragments of attention just to keep your loyalty, you stop mistaking crumbs for connection. You stop begging for love that you can give yourself. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. It wasn't love. It was a lesson in control, not over them, but over yourself. Control of your impulses, your emotions, your expectations. When you stop reacting to what hurts you, you reclaim your power. When you stop chasing closure, you become closure. When you stop explaining your worth, you start embodying it. The person who left taught you boundaries. The silence that followed taught you patience. The emptiness that remained taught you strength. Pain is not your enemy. It's your initiation into power. You learned what no book could teach. That detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. That silence is not avoidance, it's wisdom. That solitude is not punishment, it's transformation. What once felt like rejection was actually redirection. Not toward someone else, but toward the highest version of yourself. This is the paradox of heartbreak. The one who hurts you is often the one who saves you, because they force you to stop lying to yourself. You wanted love, but life gave you truth instead. And that's the most merciful thing it could have done. Because truth lasts. The person doesn't. You were addicted to how they made you feel, not who they were. You saw in them what you wanted to believe existed in yourself. Confidence, charisma, control. But all of it was projection. They mirrored your potential, not your destiny. You didn't meet them by accident. Life timed it perfectly. It sent them when you were vulnerable enough to learn and strong enough to survive the loss. They entered to awaken something, not to stay. The lesson was never about how to love them. It was about how to love yourself without needing them. You passed through obsession to reach balance, through fantasy to reach truth, through loss to reach freedom. Pain is the tuition of growth, and you paid it in full. One day, you'll thank the silence that followed them, because in that silence, you met the person you were always supposed to become. Attachment wears the mask of love until you learn to see beyond the surface. It whispers promises that sound eternal, but are anchored in fear. You think you're drawn to someone's essence, but often you're drawn to the part of them that fits your wounds. They touch something inside you, not because they're meant for you, but because they activate the unfinished chapters of your past. You confuse that emotional electricity with destiny, yet it's just trauma searching for recognition. The connection feels magnetic because pain recognizes itself. You're not in love with them. You're in love with the feeling of being seen, even if it's fleeting, even if it's not real. And when that recognition disappears, when their eyes no longer mirror your worth, you call it heartbreak. But heartbreak is not the breaking of love. It's the breaking of illusion. That's why it feels like death. Because a version of your identity dies with it. The version that believed love could be earned, that believed if you gave enough, waited enough, or forgave enough, you would be chosen. You see, we don't fall in love. We fall into patterns. The faces change, but the lessons repeat until we understand the pattern is within us. They weren't the first person to make you feel like this, were they? The pain feels familiar because it's cyclical. You keep finding different names for the same emotional wound. And the universe keeps sending mirrors until you stop looking at them and start looking at yourself. That's why silence after attachment feels like withdrawal. You were never addicted to the person, only to the chemical illusion your mind created around them. Dopamine made it look like destiny, but destiny doesn't make you beg. It makes you grow. You kept replaying memories, dissecting words, searching for closure, but closure doesn't come from them. It comes from realizing they were a symptom, not the cure. Love doesn't leave you anxious, uncertain, or diminished. That's not love. That's emotional dependency in disguise. And dependency always collapses when the supply disappears. You called it love because that made the pain feel noble, but it wasn't love. It was your unhealed self clinging to someone who reflected your need to be chosen. You tried to fix them because you thought that if you could heal their chaos, you'd finally deserve peace. But people don't change because of your love. They change because of their own pain. You can't save someone who benefits from staying broken. You can't be someone's peace when they crave chaos. And you can't build stability with someone who confuses attention with affection. The truth hurts, but it liberates. They never deceived you. You deceived yourself by insisting that they were different, that this time it meant something deeper. You ignored the signs, the inconsistencies, the subtle absence of reciprocity, because the fantasy was more comforting than reality. You built temples around potential and prayed to possibilities. But love is not potential, it's presence. It's not found in what someone could be. It's found in what they consistently are. The lesson, then, is not about them leaving. It's about you finally learning to stop worshipping what wounds you. Every unreturned message, every cold response, every half-truth, it all had one purpose: to teach you where not to place your energy again. Because energy is currency, and you spent yours trying to buy love from someone emotionally bankrupt. You learned that attention is not affection, and words are not guarantees. You learned that consistency is the real form of love, and silence often speaks louder than promises. The pain carved wisdom into your soul. It stripped you of illusions you once called hope. It forced you to confront how easily you confuse intensity with importance. You thought the fire between you meant fate, but fire also burns everything it touches. The truth is, you were never losing love. You were shedding illusion. You had to lose them to stop betraying yourself. And that loss, as cruel as it felt, was your initiation into inner authority. That's when you stop asking why they changed and start asking why you ignored the moment they did. That's when you understand that love without respect is addiction. That's when you stop romanticizing the storm and start appreciating the calm. Pain matures you faster than comfort ever could. It refines your discernment. It transforms you from someone who chases validation to someone who commands peace. You stop searching for people who feel like home and start building the home within yourself, Because if your heart is still dependent on external approval, you will always be at the mercy of others' moods. Power begins when dependency ends. It begins the moment you can look at what broke you and say, "Thank you for the lesson." Not out of weakness, but out of clarity. Because forgiveness isn't about them. It's about releasing the version of yourself that kept repeating old stories. You learned that love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes love means walking away before the decay begins. Sometimes it means protecting your energy from those who confuse your patience with permission. You once thought letting go was loss, but now you see it's evolution. You're not colder now. You're cleaner. You no longer need the noise of someone else's chaos to feel alive. You've replaced intensity with inner stillness, and in that stillness you discovered your true reflection. It wasn't love, it was a mirror. And once you learned the lesson, the mirror broke, because it was never meant to hold you forever. It was only meant to show you who you were before you forgot. Pain is the most honest mirror you'll ever face. It doesn't lie, it doesn't flatter, it doesn't protect your ego. It strips away every illusion you built to keep yourself comfortable. When love ends, what you call heartbreak is actually exposure. Exposure to the truth about your capacity to attach, to chase, to surrender your peace for a taste of validation. You think they broke you, but they only revealed how easily you break when your worth depends on someone else's attention. Every wound is an X-ray of your emotional architecture. Look closely, and you'll see where your foundations were weak. You'll see how much of your love was built on hope, not reality. That's the difference between genuine love and illusion. Love grows you. Illusion drains you. Love teaches expansion. Illusion teaches dependence. The pain that followed them wasn't punishment. It was purification. You were detoxing from the fantasy you created. The late-night memories, the songs that suddenly became unbearable, the emptiness you felt in silence. All of it was withdrawal from a version of yourself that needed to be needed. You thought you missed them, but you were actually missing the person you became when they paid attention to you. The reflection they gave you made you feel significant, and when they disappeared, that reflection vanished too. That's why heartbreak feels like erasure, not because they were your everything, but because they represented the validation you hadn't yet given yourself. Love, at its purest, doesn't create dependency. It creates growth. It doesn't demand constant reassurance because it exists beyond fear. But what most people call love is a negotiation between wounds. You loved them for the way they made your insecurity feel safe, and they loved you for how your devotion fed their ego. That's not love. That's a transaction built on emotion. Pain shows you that truth. It dismantles the illusion piece by piece until you can see the naked structure beneath. That's why heartbreak is so transformative. It's the destruction of the lie you built around another person. You can't truly know yourself until someone teaches you your breaking point. And once you find it, you also find your threshold for growth. You stop running from solitude because you realize solitude doesn't kill you, it strengthens you. You begin to notice the quiet power in not needing to explain, not needing to prove, not needing to chase. The moment you can sit in silence without reaching for distraction, you have already reclaimed your power, because power begins where desperation ends. You learn that love without peace is chaos wearing perfume, that some people enter your life not to love you, but to provoke the transformation that love will later recognize. They come as lessons disguised as lovers, carrying the exact traits that challenge your weaknesses. You call it betrayal, but the universe calls it alignment, an invitation to evolve beyond your emotional dependencies. You were meant to learn discernment. You were meant to understand that not everything that feels right is right. Sometimes what feels magnetic is just a repetition of pain wearing a different face. Until you break the pattern, you'll keep calling familiar chaos chemistry. But chemistry fades. Clarity stays. Pain introduces you to clarity. It forces you to look where you didn't want to. It shows you that love is not measured by intensity, but by consistency, by peace, by presence. You used to think silence after love was cruel, but now you see it as sacred. It's the stillness where wisdom is born. It's the void where you rebuild your sense of self. The same silence that once haunted you now heals you, because you finally understand that silence isn't emptiness, it's alignment with yourself. The person who left made space for the person you were supposed to become. Pain cleaned the lens through which you view connection. It taught you to stop romanticizing what hurts and start respecting what heals. And as you step back from the ruins of what was, you start to see the architecture of what will be, a self no longer built on fear but on inner authority. Love will return someday, but it will no longer be about filling your void. It will be about sharing your wholeness. You won't crave validation, you'll command respect. You won't chase excitement, you'll choose peace. That's when you know the lesson has been integrated, when your standards rise silently and your energy speaks for you. What was once pain becomes protection. What was once loss becomes liberation. You'll realize that what you thought was the end was actually the moment you began to understand love for the first time. It wasn't love. It was the lesson that taught you how to love properly, beginning with yourself. There comes a moment when the noise fades, when the ache that used to echo inside you begins to soften, and you start hearing something different, the quiet rhythm of yourself returning. It doesn't happen all at once. Healing rarely announces itself. It begins in small ways, when you stop checking your phone, when their name no longer sharpens your heartbeat, when you realize that peace feels better than passion. That's the first sign of transformation. When calm starts to seduce you more than chaos ever did. You thought losing them would destroy you, but all it did was dismantle the illusions you mistook for identity. You no longer crave the drama that used to define connection, because you finally understand that peace isn't boring. It's sacred. You start to rebuild from the inside out. You become deliberate with your time, protective with your energy, selective with your emotions. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That's when you begin to understand power. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes the atmosphere when it enters a room. You begin to see how rare true detachment is in a world obsessed with validation. Detachment doesn't mean indifference, it means control. It means you no longer bleed emotionally every time someone withdraws. It means you've learned to observe rather than react, to respond with silence rather than defense. You stop chasing closure because you realize closure is just acceptance in disguise. You give yourself the answers you once begged others to give. That's freedom, and that freedom becomes addictive in a way chaos never was. You start to see love differently too. You no longer see it as something to possess, but as something to honor. You understand that genuine love doesn't demand attention. It commands respect. It doesn't suffocate, it breathes. It doesn't leave you guessing. It provides clarity through consistency. When you rebuild yourself, you also rebuild your definition of love. You stop calling anxiety connection and start recognizing that true connection feels like stillness. You no longer need constant validation because you finally met the version of yourself that doesn't need to be chosen to feel worthy. You realize that the love you were searching for was never external. It was waiting behind every boundary you were afraid to enforce. The person who once broke your heart becomes irrelevant, not because you hate them, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed them. The past stops feeling personal. It starts feeling instructive. You stop resenting them for leaving and start thanking them for revealing the parts of you that needed to evolve. That's the paradox of growth. The people who hurt you the most often contribute the most to your transformation. You can't become powerful without pain. You can't learn self-control without first losing it. You can't master silence until you've said too much. You can't discover emotional independence until you've been abandoned. Everything that wounded you was also sculpting you. Every disappointment was a form of divine intervention. Every rejection redirected your energy towards self-mastery. And now, you're not bitter, you're awake. That's what maturity feels like, realizing that you no longer need revenge, attention, or closure. You just need peace. And peace doesn't need to prove anything. You become quiet in your confidence. You understand that people only take from you when you allow it. You realize that energy, not words, reveals intention. You no longer chase explanations. You study patterns. You no longer believe promises, you observe behavior. And the silence that once felt like punishment now feels like privilege. You are no longer afraid of being alone because solitude has become your sanctuary. It's where your intuition sharpens, where your clarity grows, where your energy resets. You learn to listen, not to others, but to yourself. The voice that was once buried under need now speaks with calm authority. It tells you what's real, what's fake, what's aligned, what's draining. It teaches you to walk away not in anger, but in composure. Because real power doesn't need a scene, it simply exits. You start to see how your stillness unsettles others, how your lack of reaction exposes their lack of control. And that's when you realize you've crossed an invisible line. You've become untouchable. Not because you've built walls, but because you've built wisdom. You've replaced desperation with discernment. You've learned that silence is the highest form of communication when dealing with people who thrive on chaos. You've learned that not responding is also a form of response, one that carries the weight of emotional maturity. The person you were before the pain would have begged for closure, argued for clarity, fought for attention. The person you are now simply observes, smiles, and withdraws. That's evolution. You are no longer a participant in emotional wars. You are a witness to them. You've learned the power of letting things die in silence. You've learned that sometimes the strongest statement is absence. That's the true art of control, the ability to influence without reacting, to maintain mystery without effort, to command respect without words. You've entered a new phase of existence, one where your peace is your power and your silence is your weapon. It wasn't love. It was the lesson that rebuilt you from the ashes of illusion into the architecture of power. The real lesson didn't arrive when they left. It began the moment you stopped asking why. Because once you stop searching for reasons, you start seeing the pattern. You begin to understand that people don't come into your life to complete you. They come to reveal what's incomplete. You start realizing that every connection is a mirror, every disappointment a teacher, every ending a doorway to a higher version of yourself. You stop romanticizing what broke you, and you start studying it. Because pain, when observed with calmness, becomes wisdom. You see now that what you called love was merely an echo of your own longing. You weren't in love with them. You were in love with the part of you that finally felt seen, even if just for a moment. You mistook being noticed for being understood. But understanding doesn't demand performance. It recognizes essence. The lesson was to stop performing, to stop shrinking yourself to be palatable, to stop explaining your worth to those committed to misunderstanding you. You once believed love required sacrifice, but now you understand that real love requires alignment. You can't build connection from imbalance. You can't build peace from chaos. And you can't build trust from inconsistency. The person you lost didn't take love with them. They took distraction. What remains is the raw material of your strength, because once you have endured emotional withdrawal, every other form of loss becomes manageable. You no longer fear absence, you respect it. Absence becomes the filter that reveals who truly values your presence, and you begin to see silence differently, not as emptiness, but as evidence of control. The one who can stay silent while others seek validation holds the real power, because silence unnerves the insecure, exposes the manipulative, and attracts the disciplined. It's not an act of avoidance, it's a declaration of self-mastery. You no longer explain yourself to people who cannot hear you beyond their projections. You no longer chase closure because you've understood the deeper law. Those who wrong you often don't feel the depth of what they've done, and that's precisely why they did it. Waiting for them to see your pain is like asking a mirror to feel your reflection. The lesson was never about them understanding you. It was about you understanding yourself enough to never need that again. That's power. You've now entered a state where peace is more seductive than validation, where solitude feels safer than inconsistency, where mystery becomes your natural state. You understand now that those who truly have depth rarely broadcast it. They let their silence do the talking. You've learned to love quietly, to detach gracefully, to observe patiently. That's what life was teaching you through heartbreak, emotional discipline, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that commands respect without demand. People will sense it in you now, that unspoken authority that comes from surviving your own illusions. You won't need to prove that you've changed. Your energy will make it obvious. You'll attract differently, speak differently, move differently. You'll realize that peace isn't passive. It's the ultimate form of control. Because when nothing external can disturb your inner stability, you become dangerous in a world addicted to reaction. The pain that once consumed you becomes the foundation of your composure. The silence that once tormented you becomes your language. The solitude that once frightened you becomes your empire. And in that stillness you realize something profound, that the people who hurt you were never villains. They were volunteers. They entered your life on time and left on purpose. Their role was not to stay, it was to awaken, and when you stop resenting them, you free yourself. That's when you finally see that every heartbreak was a training in emotional control. Every rejection was preparation for alignment. Every silence was an invitation to listen inward. Life doesn't break you to destroy you. It breaks you to remove what was weak. You thought you lost something precious, but what you lost was dependency. What you gained was self-respect. You no longer chase love because you've become it. You no longer fear distance because you've learned presence within yourself. You no longer crave attention because you've understood that energy doesn't beg, it attracts. And now, you move differently. You love from fullness, not from lack. You connect without clinging, you speak less but mean more. You know that not everyone deserves access, and you no longer apologize for boundaries that protect your peace. You've become selective, not cynical, strong, not hardened, wise, not detached. You've learned that the ultimate lesson hidden inside what you once called love is self-sovereignty. The ability to be whole without being held. That's what they came to teach you. That's what pain whispered beneath the noise. It wasn't love. It was preparation for power. The kind of power that doesn't need validation to exist. The kind of power that moves in silence, that commands through energy, that forgives without re-entry. You've reached the place where forgiveness doesn't mean weakness, it means understanding. You no longer seek to win people back, you seek to win yourself fully. And when you finally do, you realize that everything that left was supposed to. Nothing real ever escapes alignment. What's meant for you doesn't require you to lose yourself to keep it. What's meant for you recognizes your silence and respects it. What's meant for you speaks the same language, calm, clarity, consistency. The lesson wasn't about losing love, it was about learning discernment. Because discernment is the final stage of power, the ability to know what to allow and what to release without resentment. That's when you finally graduate from emotional survival to emotional sovereignty. You don't shout, you don't chase, you don't beg. You simply exist in calm authority. You've become what pain tried to teach, composed, grounded, unavailable to chaos. That is the real ending of every great lesson. Not triumph, but transcendence. If this truth resonates with you, it's because you've already started to wake up. You're remembering what real power feels like. Subscribe, not to a channel, but to yourself. Because real power doesn't shout, it whispers.